Good morning, and thank you everybody for coming today. It's really great to be back in Boulder, on the campus where I first started studying educational research and also where I conducted my undergraduate studies. So it's nice to be back. Feels like a nice homecoming. I want to thank Kevin, who can't be here this morning, as well as Bill and Alex and others at NEPC for inviting me to come share a little bit about this forthcoming brief on school turnarounds. It's due to come out, I believe, in a couple of weeks, and to talk with you about some of the troubling patterns in the policy, in the practice, in the literature on school turnarounds, and also to discuss the areas where we see potential for more democratic engagement in the improvement of struggling schools that serve primarily children of color and poor children. But first, I want to make sure to thank my co-author on the brief, Michelle Renee. She's from the Annenberg Institute for School Reform. Michelle's expertise on community organizing was absolutely invaluable to the brief that I'm going to discuss with you today, so thank you to Michelle. So this is a really exciting time in public education, and you can't look very far before finding somebody who has an idea about what to do to improve struggling schools that serve children of color and poor kids. You can't hear me? All right. Okay. All right. How about now? Okay. Let me start again. Not all the way. All right. I'm talking about the exciting time in public education. All right. You can hear that? All right. So yeah, I said you can't look very far before you find somebody with an idea about what to do to improve struggling schools that serve primarily kids of color and poor kids. Right? So if you look around the big cities, big urban centers, you have mayors who are saying that education is one of their top priorities. If you look at Hollywood these days, they're putting out major films about school improvement, all of which endorse corporate-style reforms, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. And as a plug, NEPC just released a couple of great briefs that critically examine one of the most recent of these films. We have actors jumping into the debates, right? So you'll see Matt Damon speaking out for teachers' professional expertise, for example. And we have several high-profile district leaders, superintendents, chancellors, who are making the front pages because of their campaigns to scale back collective bargaining, to institute test-based teacher evaluation, and to center school systems and principles of competition, choice, measurement, and rigid accountability. So a lot is brewing right now in public education. And one of the things that is so interesting about all of these efforts is the ways in which individuals, organizations, and the government, in one way or another, invoke arguments about democracy. So some make it more explicit than others, but most of them contend that their policy is intended to further democratic aims somehow. And most of them equate democratic goals with economic ones, right? They invoke the familiar argument that if students perform well on standardized test scores, they presumably will be better prepared to compete in the workforce, which will presumably make them more productive citizens and presumably create a more productive economy and secure democratic nation. Okay, but implicit in this logic are a lot of assumptions about the democratic potential of these types of policies. And they're assumptions that in most cases have been disproven by empirical study. Right? And unpacking some of these assumptions in policies like this is what I'd like to talk with you a little bit about this morning. Now, before I go into some of the ideas in the brief, I want us to think about last night's speech by the president. So raise your hand if you saw it, read about it, heard it. Okay, great. All right. Active audience. So I found some of his comments really illuminating, and I thought they really reflected the tensions in the policies that I'm talking about today. So Obama invoked arguments about poverty and equity, right? That was the first thing he did, right? And he said that no child should have her dreams deferred because of a crowded classroom or a crumbling school. And later he said that government has a role in this too. But then he said, but teachers must inspire, principals must lead, parents must instill a thirst for learning, and students have got to do the work, right? And together he stated that we can out-educate and out-compete any country on earth. And he repeatedly said that you can choose that future for America. You can choose to develop the kinds of skills that lead to jobs for Americans. And he kind of wrapped up at one point and said, this democracy is ours, but it's only you that have the power to move us forward. And he kept stating that you, individuals, have a choice. And I thought, what does he want to convey with this language about choice and competition and individual responsibility for achievement? What principles is he trying to invoke? Well, he's invoking a market logic about the way the world works to a certain degree. And under this logic, individuals are in complete control over their own gain and their educational accomplishments. Right? If they work hard, if they just compete, they can choose these better life outcomes, just like we choose our commodities in a competitive market. Right? But this logic de-emphasizes the insidious roles that we know poverty and structural racism and systemic disparities in funding, for example, play in predicting students' life outcomes. And it's a highly individualized way of characterizing our country and our schools. And it's a way of thinking that de-emphasizes our collective responsibility. Some of these principles that Ken and David were talking about, our collective responsibility for more public group-oriented educational goals. Right? And this logic reduces our goals for teaching and learning in a sense, because it reduces them to fairly narrow ones that emphasize competition and individual achievement. Individual achievement typically defined as performance on standardized test scores. Right? And this is what Linda McNeil is talking about when she writes that high-stakes accountability policies reduce public education to a private good by measuring and thereby validating only highly individualized means of achievement. Okay, so keep this logic in mind as we go forward this morning. Okay, so in 2009, the Obama administration announced its intention to turn around 5,000 of our country's lowest performing schools. And they said they were going to do that by reviving the Federal School Improvement Program, or the SIG program, by temporarily channeling increased federal funding into states and schools with really poor test scores, persistently low test scores. And the idea behind the SIG program is simple. It assumes that interrupting persistent low performance calls for quick, drastic action, right, plus an infusion of temporary dollars to help implement it. But it's not that simple, like most policies. So the federal policy mandates that SIG-funded schools implement one of 4 prescribed reforms. Each of these are borrowed from the corporate sector. So it mandates that SIG schools either implement a turnaround reform, a transformation, they restart the school under new management, or they just close it altogether. And now turnaround, the second most frequently chosen model, this one mandates that a school's principals and teachers be fired. Right? Now the new principal has the option to rehire some of the teachers, but it's essentially mandating massive layoffs. And in the public debate about the SIG program, turnaround reforms have been described as new and innovative and compelling. But in reality, the nation already has significant experience with these models. This is what the brief that the forthcoming brief goes into detail about. And we have about 3 or 4 generations of research which show that SIG reforms are actually based on fairly faulty evidence about what helps schools improve. And they're not supported by empirical research. And in fact, they usually ignore evidence to the contrary. For example, one major assumption behind the turnaround policy is that in the corporate sector, turnarounds have worked. Right? Well, we actually know from a fair amount of research that corporate turnarounds have rarely yielded improvements in organizational performance or in financial gain for private corporations. Okay. Another erroneous assumption behind the turnaround policy is that drastic reconstitution of school staff will prove beneficial. Right? But we have a fair amount of research that's documented over decades how this actually isn't the case. And this is because the nation's lowest scoring schools are typically those that are hardest to staff. They're in communities that have a very difficult time attracting teachers who are highly qualified and who will stay in the classroom. Right? So there's this inherent logistical problem, finding better qualified personnel to refill the vacancies in these new turnaround schools. So in New York, for example, under the new turnaround policy, some districts are finding themselves swapping principals from one turnaround school to another. Right? In Louisville, we see that over 40% of teachers who are hired to work in turnaround schools are brand new because they can't find more experienced teachers to hire. Right? In another region, we're seeing hiring difficulties that are forcing a lot of turnaround schools to begin the school year with high numbers of substitutes. So because of these and other problems, research has found reconstitution to be ineffective. Right? It weakens school systems, it causes staff upheaval, it chips away at teacher and community morale, it crushes it really. And it actually increases the racial and the socioeconomic isolation of the schools that it claims to be serving. Okay? Now, ironically, last night Obama commented in a speech, I don't know if any of you noticed this, but he said, "I don't believe that firing teachers will help us. We've been there, we've tried that, and we aren't going back. We're going forward," he said. And I found this comment perplexing, given that a central tenet of his program is to fire teachers. Right? Now, hopefully he's beginning to see that this aspect of his policies is actually ineffective or is unpopular. More cynically, maybe he just knows that this is what focus groups and telephone polls said was a popular phrase to throw out there in the speech. But either way, at the end of the day, what we know from the empirical work on school reform, on urban school reform, is that these types of policies don't work, and that in fact they hinder the progress of urban struggling schools. Now, alongside these policy developments, and this is something that we go into in the report, but I'll just speak briefly to about now, a collection of writing on school turnarounds is springing up. And this writing on school turnarounds looks surprisingly like the school effectiveness studies of earlier generations and the now more recent district effectiveness studies of school generations. And it's just mushrooming. And this literature repeats several of the significant methodological errors of the earlier studies, particularly in its narrow reliance on standardized test scores as the main measure of success, and its haphazard selection of these success cases for successful turnarounds that are based on very short-term or anecdotal but unsystematic evidence about how the schools are working out. And this turnaround literature also focuses, like this previous literature, almost exclusively on the within-school factors that affect student performance or student outcomes, right? But it's virtually silent on the pervasive effects of contextual factors related to race, related to poverty, related to funding inequalities, which we know from research have enormous effects on how students turn out, right? So the guiding assumption in this new turnaround literature is that schools have the capability to overcome these factors. Therefore, punitive sanctions must be justified, right? So fundamentally, and this connects to what you were saying this morning, Ken and David, the SIG policy is an extension of the NCLB market-based approach to education, because the driving idea behind a market theory of education is that schools can and ought to behave like we imagine private corporations to behave, right? And from this view, competition, performance monitoring, measurement, and rigid accountability for specific outcomes are all presumed to produce more effective, efficient schools. So charters, vouchers, sanctions, and all of the 4 SIG models, like turnaround and such, these are all grounded in these market-based principles. Now, in contrast, then, a democratic theory of education, like you all were talking about, this asserts that schooling is the public good, right? That's a very different way of thinking, right? It's a public good that requires the participation of diverse constituencies. And from this view, public schools are seen as furthering social change by creating opportunities for local communities to deliberate, like you were talking about this morning, and to equitably share decision-making. Now, this public deliberation is presumed, then, to promote collective engagement in the shaping of local education, and a public system whose goal is to provide all students with equitable opportunities to learn and to participate in society, right? So this is a very different logic now. So community schools, integration, policies for increasing college access, these are all examples of policies that stem from a more democratic theory of education. So the original NCLB requirement for states to identify low-performing schools was grounded in this market-based assumption, right? If you recall, so it assumes that the potential loss of money to a persistently low-performing school when parents transfer their kids to a higher-scoring school, this is going to compel schools to turn around, right? The competitive pressures are going to be enough to motivate them to change, right? And the SIG grants were originally just the SIG program that had funding attached to it. They were originally seen as a carrot that was added to the stick, right? Because they added money to the equation. And although this current SIG policy is framed as a departure from the previous high-stakes accountability policies, this reinvented SIG program is intimately linked to these NCLB policies that you were talking about this morning. Right? So standardized test scores are still the main means for identifying schools for intervention, and punitive sanctions for underperformance still remain a central part of this policy. Right, so this SIG policy, this turnaround policy, still remains grounded in these market-based ideas because it assumes that strong external threats are enough to motivate teachers and principals to improve their practice. It assumes that standardized test scores are reliable measures of learning. It assumes that meaningful, sustainable changes can actually be spurred through competition. And it assumes that these outcome-oriented accountability policies can effectively interrupt these historical and social patterns of low performance. So in other words, this policy assumes that the only barrier to success is a lack of motivation and incentive, and that the best form of motivation and incentive is money. Right? So while these market-based policy ideas aren't new, what we see under the current administration is a program that increases their prominence in the discourse on school reform and the practice of turning around low-performing schools, those that serve primarily children of color and poor kids. Okay, so this brief doesn't stop just at this critique, though. It also points out what's missing in these policies, right? So many experts consider community engagement critical for turnarounds to succeed. So we have federal and state policymakers, though, that are rarely involving the public in this turnaround decision-making process and the design of the policies. Okay. That said, as the SIG program has unfolded over the last few years, several communities have organized to collectively propose strategies for more equitable and democratic turnarounds. So these are strategies that are supported by the research on community organizing, and this research tends to link community organizing with more effective teacher recruitment and retention. It links the organizing with improved curricula, with increased equity in school funding and higher student performance. And right now we see a growing number of community-based organizations that are collectively advocating for ways to prioritize explicit goals for teaching and learning in turnaround and SIG-funded schools. We see community organizations that are developing turnaround plans with collaboration with educators and parents and communities and outside experts, engaging in the type of deliberation that Ken's and David's framework is calling for. And we see them advocating for incorporating more wraparound services to address the contextual conditions that are typical of these low-performing schools. And what they're advocating for is a more democratic, a more organic approach to deliberating about the kinds of schools that local communities want. Now in the report we talk about some of the examples of how this looks, but I won't go into the detail here. But I'll say that we conclude with a set of recommendations. And it's also accompanied by sample legislative codes, so thanks to a couple of attorneys who wrote the code to accompany the report. And these recommendations are intended to recenter the purposes of public education then for low-income students, for students of color, and for local communities in developing more equitable democratic turnarounds. And I can talk specifically to these recommendations, which very much echo the proposals put forth this morning during the conversation. I'll stop there.